Sorry, I thought I said that.
I thought I saw that too. Okay.
Welcome, everyone, to Safe Space for White Questions. Welcome back. If you have joined us before on previous episodes, welcome for the first time, if this is indeed your very first time. My name is Alex Kasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount St. Vincent University, where I teach in the sociology and anthropology department. But here, along with my partner in crime, AJ Parasram, we take your questions and discuss issues surrounding social justice, racialized injustice, racialized identity questions, and just general questions about how we can make the world a better place for all of us. So we're happy to do that with you this month, as we usually do. Just a reminder about the format. We are taking your questions live through our Google form. We are taking your questions beforehand. So please feel free to write them in right now if you haven't already. We're going to start with a couple of questions that we have left over from previous sessions that we haven't had a chance to get to, and hopefully continue this lively discussion. Just a couple of announcements before I throw things over to AJ to introduce himself. First of all, I want to acknowledge that this session, our entire series here, indeed our lives here, our projected identities are coming to you from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory in Kitsipuktuk, Mi'kma'ki. That's Halifax, Nova Scotia for its settler colonial name. And we're very happy to be here with you today. We couldn't be here with you without the wonderful support and all the bottom lining that goes on from our very good friends at Fernwood Publishing, who take care of all the hard work behind the scenes and promoting this little shindig that we do here. And on that note, I want to make an announcement that's going to be frustrating, but in this era of constant branding, I think you'll all be familiar with it, that we have an announcement about an announcement coming out. That's a bit of a spin-off off of the work that we've been doing here coming up in the next few months. So a surprise announcement that we won't talk about today, but we have an exciting project spinning off of this series that we've been running since last year. And we will talk to you about that in coming sessions. So that's all I'll say for now. Other than that, I'm going to throw it over to AJ for his introductions, and then we're going to get to your questions.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'm AJ Parasram. I'm a faculty member in history and international development studies, and occasionally in political science, all here at Dalhousie University. And yeah, we've been, like Alex kind of said it all, we've been doing this question and answer session for a good long while now. Loving your questions, working on other projects related to it that we'll tell you about later. And without further ado, let's jump right in there. So back to you then, Alex.
Okay, sorry, just turning my mic back on there, folks. All right, so again, if you're with us for the first time, we don't want to rehash everything, but for those of you who don't know how we do this, essentially we take your questions. The person who leads it off, and this month that's me, reads the question. I take a shot at answering it, then we pass it over to the other person, and they chime in too, and we just go back and forth. And please keep in mind that we are reading your questions as we're getting them. We're not preparing for them in advance. So this is meant very much to be a dialogue, an unprepared, fairly non-expert approach. We're not trying to lecture to you. We're not trying to moralize to you, and we're not trying to give you professional advice, although we both do research and have activist histories that align with these areas. So we're speaking from a place of experience, but not trying to be dry and dusty experts with you. So that's just how this works. So let's go to the first question. The first question is, I'm a white woman and my Indian husband and mother-in-law bought me some beautiful salwar kameez. Am I pronouncing that right, AJ? Okay.
You are indeed.
Thanks. They are beautiful, and my husband and mother-in-law want me to wear them. My Indian colleague asked me if I have salwar kameez, and when I explained that I do, she asked me why I don't wear them. I proceeded to wear the tunic the next day, and a non-Indian colleague expressed that I was offensive and that it was cultural appropriation to wear these clothes. My husband is upset and feels that it is fine for me to wear these clothes. He's offended by this reaction. What do I do? So, thank you, first of all, for this question. I mean, we get these questions about cultural appropriation not infrequently. This is a hard topic for sure, like many of those that we deal with on this series. But this one is particularly interesting, I think, because it's got a couple of layers to it. So you're a non-Indian person. You identify yourself as white, but your husband and his family are of Indian ancestry. They have given you a gift. They have given it to you in good faith, fully aware that you are a white identified person, and have encouraged you to wear, and in fact, probably if they're anything like many family members, in-laws, friends, they would be offended if they never saw you in them, right? In this clothing. So that makes total sense. So there are a couple of pieces I want to pull apart here. One is the cultural appropriation piece, and the other is this being accused, essentially, or being confronted by a person not from the community or from the identity group that's associated with the group supposedly being appropriated from, making the accusation, right? So I think, as we've discussed before here, I'm not going to say too much on this because we have addressed this in previous sessions, and I don't want to belabor the point. The cultural appropriation is a tricky category for many of us. While it's an important thing to discuss, and I think we talked a lot about it in different ways. We've talked about Halloween costumes. We've talked about mascots. We've talked about the use and abuse in the Canadian context of Indigenous identity, histories, as the colonial nation state attempts to appropriate that in order to like ground itself here while doing terrible violence to actual Indigenous people. Those examples tend to be a little bit easier to parse out, right? I think most people in good faith can recognize why it's offensive, say for a professional sports team, to use somebody else's collective identity as their mascot, right? And even if you're a big fan, many pro sports teams are learning this lesson. Many people, thankfully, although this still crops up, have learned that it's not okay to make somebody's cultural identity into your costume for Halloween, right? These kinds of things. We get the white people with dreadlocks question sometimes, all these things. This question is I think much more like, it's both much more everyday, and it's much more complicated in that sense. I would say, and this again, from my perspective, from my own lived perspective, as well as somebody who thinks about these issues, I certainly don't think what you're doing is cultural appropriation. You are recognized as being a living part of somebody's kin group. They have given you a gift, fully aware of what your background is, and obviously aware of what your identity is, and have encouraged you to enjoy it and to wear it. And in fact, interestingly enough, you've been asked by other colleagues from that same group, from that community, if you have those items, and why don't you wear them then? So then you did wear it and you came into work, and somebody not from that group accused you of essentially doing a racist thing and appropriating that heritage for your own consumption, apparently. So yeah, I mean, I think this for me, obviously, like, it's a problematic thing to do. That person probably acting out of a sense of moral righteousness, is trying to make sure that other, and to give them the best, all credit. They're probably trying to do the thing to avoid, to try to say, okay, other white people, like, don't be this person. Don't turn other people into your object of consumption. But your history is different. I mean, my first question would be, does your white colleague understand any of the backstory here? Do they know that your husband is of Indian descent? Do they know this story? It would be great if they had approached you and asked you these things first, like, hey, that's beautiful. Can I ask, do you have a connection organically to the traditions that clothing comes from? What's up with that? Where did you, how did you come by it? There are ways of kind of sussing this out that are less antagonistic and less confrontational. And obviously, from your story anyway, it seems that they didn't take that approach. So It's not surprising that you're hurt, that your husband is offended on your behalf, and probably because he's been kind of roped into this accusation of cultural appropriation. Obviously, he's offended by that. I mean, my suggestion, and then I'm going to throw it over to AJ since I've spent all my time outlining what I see the problem is. But my suggestion would be to at least begin by having a like a firm but casual conversation with the coworker who made the accusation, and just laying it out there, starting with, hey, you made this comment, and to be honest, like, it really offended me. It hurt me in part because, and then just, quickly, you don't need to offer up your life story to somebody to ground yourself. And nobody should feel a need to do that. It often sounds like you're making excuses for yourself. You don't need to do that. But saying something like, this was given to me by family members. And by the way, those family members aren't just other white people. They are indeed people from that cultural group. And, they wanted me to wear it. I think it's beautiful. I'm connected to this. Did you know any of that? And hopefully upon hearing that, they apologize. They try to treat you like a human. I would try and keep it at that level. I think this is a good example of people wrestling with this very thorny issue of cultural appropriation, and a person acting in a fit of pique that probably took them further than they should go. But I think, in some ways, I guess I would prefer that well-meaning white people are more sort of sensitive about issues of consuming other people's culture than be flippant and flagrant about it and be like, oh, well, whatever, everything goes, everything's cool, we can just consume wantonly. So I would definitely say you have every right to be hurt, and you have every right to want to clarify this, but I would try to do so at the level of, decent interpersonal conversation, and think of it as a way of opening up that conversation to help that person think more critically and carefully about how they intervene, what's effective, and what cultural appropriation is. So it's like asking you to do a little bit more work when it comes to this issue of having this conversation, especially when you're feeling like sensitive about it, which I totally get. But I would say for me, that's the route that I would take. Over to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. That was very comprehensive on the cultural appropriation front. So I'm actually not going to talk about cultural appropriation at all. Alex got that bit. I do want to talk a little bit about Orientalism, because I feel like Orientalism as a distinct sort of thing is a little bit at play here. Certainly the accusation of Orientalism and some of the harms and considerations around it. First of all, I totally agree. You're not doing anything wrong. Your family that's Indian gave you some clothes to wear, and you should wear it and look wonderful and feel wonderful in those clothes. Until around the year 1700, India clothed most of the world. Indian textiles, Indian fabric, Indian design and aesthetics were understood in relatively speaking, for the 1700s, global terms. Indian traders traveled all across into Africa, through Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, up to China, probably as far as Greece, even from thousands of years before that. Indian culture was synonymous in many sense with the understanding of globalization in the ancient world. Something happened after 1700 in particular that really shrunk that cultural impact of Indian culture in the rest of the world. So again, not to say that I'm not trying to be flippant at all about colonialism, but the deindustrialization of India, the Orientalist fetishization of India that has happened in the last 200-300 years in particular, has rendered the aesthetic of Indian clothes, of Indian things, as something that is costume-like, or something that is abnormal. But for the majority of the people in the world, I would argue, there's nothing unusual about Asian clothes. And certainly when you wear them because you're part of that community, which is not limited to race in that way, like as Alex was talking about, expanding kin relationships. To be perfectly honest with you, I am far less concerned if I see a white woman wearing salwar kameez or any other varieties of Indian clothes than I am seeing somebody like purporting to be an expert on the practice of yoga in some sanitized stadium with a Ganesh Murti sitting on the top of their toilet, which are things that I see and which communicate to me clearly a commodification and a fetishization of the culture that I in particular come from. There's good ways to go about doing things, and there's really bad ways. And a person who wears clothes that are beautiful and speak to a cultural legacy that was given in good faith, no problems whatsoever with that. A person who wants to, put a bodhisattva or a Buddha sitting in their garden without any consideration for how maybe the Thai Buddhists might understand the cultural relations with that, about placement, or a murti, like a Hindu statue in a place that it doesn't belong. That shows a complete disregard for cultural history, and I'm much more concerned about that. So I would leave it there. Thanks for your question.
Great comments as always, AJ. And thank you for that question. It is a great one. We always appreciate the not that all our questions aren't great, but the nuanced ones, the ones that trade in the difficulties of daily life, are super interesting. Absolutely. So going right along to the next one, and this one is a little bit. This is just short and sweet and to the point. What goes into a decent land acknowledgement? Great question. Land acknowledgements are both common now and popular and somewhat contentious, even. So this is a very reasonable question to ask. People have concerns about it. Some people don't like them at all, not simply because they're colonial, they're settler colonials, and they refuse to acknowledge it, but because they believe they're performative and sort of are sort of the performance of enacting a decolonial posture without actually getting serious about it and doing the material work that it requires, right? So rather than giving back land, returning political autonomy, all that kind of stuff, that's the real nuts and bolts of how we settle the scales and actually return people's rightly due sovereignty or self-determination to them. We become obsessed with looking like we are the right kind of people, looking like we're good people, rhetorically affirming that stuff without changing anything about our lives materially. And that's a reasonable critique. I think it's a fair one. That said, I don't entirely agree that land acknowledgements are just performance and are useless because of it. I think just like when we deal with language, right? When we think about language and we use gender neutral pronouns or terms for to define people in terms of their their institutional work or their position within an organization or even their pronoun. We are not that's not the revolution, but it is an important way of signaling our commitment to changing the world, hopefully for the better, and also acknowledging that the way we frame and talk about things has a great deal to do with how we think about them and how we enact them. And anthropologists have banged this drum for a long time around language and linguistics, thinking about the way that language and the words we use actually deeply affects the way that we think about that world. So if you go to an event and you hear somebody say, you're not just in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but you're actually in Kichpuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, and this land is unceded and unsurrendered, and the original inhabitants are still here and exercising sovereignty over that territory. And as a settler person, it's your obligation to connect with that, do something about it, try and create a more just, liberated, peaceful, and democratic society out of it. Then I think that's a worthy land acknowledgement. That's how I've tried. I won't lie, I've given some thought to the land acknowledgement that I use to start many of the events whenever I MC in an event. And part of what I try to do, and this is just my advice to you, first of all, you have to properly identify the land of the indigenous nation that you are currently occupying. So, make sure you get that right. That's like step one in a good land acknowledgement. Step two is thinking about who you are in relation to making that acknowledgement, I think. So I clearly identify myself as a settler in all of that, right? And so in my statement, say as a settler, I want to, and for all of those who are settlers in the room with me, I don't want to speak for other people. I'm not speaking for Indigenous people. I'm not speaking for anybody but the category that I am owning. And in that moment, I'm owning my own position in the society as a settler here. And I say, for all those who are settlers in the room, I acknowledge our collective responsibility to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories, to decolonize our lives and our presences here, in order to realize that world that we want. For me, those, and I don't want to be dogmatic about this, you can make different land acknowledgements, right? I think the most important thing is, as a settler person especially, or as a visitor in somebody else's territory, to acknowledge their hospitality, to acknowledge their authority, their presence, their entitlement to those territories. That's good. But a step further is to actually issue a bit of a call to action. I like to use it for that purpose, and I encourage you to do that too, to remind people who are settlers in the room that it's not just about saying, oh, what a good person I am. I know how to say, Kichpuktuk or Mi'kma'ki, but I know something about what that means in terms of placing myself in a set of relations that reproduces that colonial reality on a daily basis. So how can I try and make that move towards materially decolonizing my presence here? What does that mean, right? Like to acknowledge different forms of authority, settle disputes differently, recognize different ways of relating to the land, non-human animals, all those kinds of things. Understanding that I exist in a midst of different socio-political and cultural experiments in being human that aren't just restricted to the ones that I am familiar with. So I think those are the good elements. Correct acknowledgement, a clear identification of the position you're speaking from, and a clear call to action, either from your perspective or for other people who belong to that identity category, or the people you believe you're speaking to in that particular moment, that night, that evening, whatever, to say why that's significant, right? And you don't have to give them a 3-point plan. You just have to be, I think, pointing the way. That's what I want to do for people who hear my land acknowledgement. I want people to think, okay, so I'm a settler. That doesn't just mean I'm going to wallow in guilt later tonight and cry like lots of tears about this, or be angry about this, or whatever, or say the words and then forget about it. What I wanted to do actually is to plant that seed that says, I'm a settler. I'd rather not be. I'd rather be like a co-inhabitant of these territories with other people who are here. How can I learn not to be a settler anymore? How can I help do away with this thing that we call settler colonialism that's shaped all of our collective experience here, and move towards a society marked by collective liberation, right? Where we're all freer because nobody is oppressed, but also nobody is oppressing, right? We're not oppressors anymore. So for me, those are the elements, but I'm going to throw it over to AJ and see what he has to say about this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Good points there for sure. I think so in my case, a lot of my research as an academic is about land and territory. So I've been thinking and working with land acknowledgements for a really long time, listening in particular to what people like Hayden King and other Indigenous scholars, some of whom were kind of like the ones who basically put it on the map, so to speak. The history is a bit longer, but Hayden King has written and spoken about this quite eloquently. And I remember reading one article he wrote where he said he kind of wishes he didn't do this. And the reason why he says is because so many people, and I've had this, Alex has probably had this too, so many people in the university or in the public or in the government will approach somebody and say, what's your land acknowledgement? I need a land acknowledgement, like it's an apple that you're going to pick from the tree. And I'm not at all saying that's what you're doing. You're whoever you are, you've asked what goes into a land acknowledgement. So right off the bat, you formulated the question correctly. Not what is your land acknowledgement, but what goes into the land acknowledgement. I think of land acknowledgements as something that should always be evolving. Because it comes fundamentally, it's about you, right? It's about the way that you are, grounding yourself and relating to the problematic nature of simultaneous understandings of land. Like if you are living in a part of Canada, it's not the case that you are either in Canada or in Timbuktu or in Mi'kma'ki. Or in Algonquin territories, you're actually simultaneously in two different places at the same time. And that's a real mind trip to think about that. And what Alex said about trying to not just be resident in Halifax or something, that's a process of movement and transformation, and your land acknowledgement needs to try to capture that and describe that ongoing process. So one of our friends, John Langdon, I've heard him say in land acknowledgements that he's given that he's learning how to be an immigrant to Mi'kma'ki as opposed to merely a citizen of Canada or Nova Scotia. And that really resonates with me, that conceptual framework, because it's a process of movement that involves recognition of the complexities. And the other thing I wanted to say about land acknowledgements is that it really does depend on where you are. Like if you're a grad student who's going to a conference, probably everybody has been like, oh gosh, what's the territory here, and tried to look it up. But it's not adequate to do it that way, and I would actually urge people to not do it that way. It's better to not do a bad land acknowledgement than it is to just try and just do one and then end up trying to perform something that isn't genuine. And one of the reasons that I come to this is that it's actually not only about Indigenous people. Like here in Nova Scotia, we have 400 years of African Nova Scotians resident here who I've heard many Mi'kmaq people go out of their way to acknowledge as quote unquote founding people to this idea of Nova Scotia. Now, this idea of Nova Scotia is something that is rather distinct from the idea of Mi'kma'ki, and yet they overlap in the territory. You understand what I mean? So they're different. So as I understand it, African Nova Scotians have a huge part to play in the formation of Nova Scotia. That formation of Nova Scotia comes much, much later than the formation of Mi'kma'ki and the Mi'kmaq language that has evolved and developed alongside the land for 20,000 years or longer. So there are different places that are happening simultaneously. And this is the case in lots of different parts too of the world, in fact, not just in Canada. So you need to be able to communicate through your land acknowledgement that that you are embarked in this process of learning the history, that you can perhaps indicate to the people who are present what the relationship is between your gathering and the land. How does it impact you? How does it impact the reason for organizing yourself there? If you're a researcher, how does it impact your research to be in these places simultaneously? And you should ideally return in the course of your event, whatever the event is, you should return to the idea of land and what it means, so that it's not just something that you say, it's something that you apply throughout. And that's hard to do, right? And it's hard to do. And what I think that means is that you shouldn't do it until you're prepared to do it. Because going back to the other point, it's like, I think we're past, fortunately, and maybe I'm wrong here, I think we're past the point where the earliest kind of application of the land acknowledgement to trouble the universality of the settler colonial state, I think we've accomplished that as a broad community. I don't know, like other people will have different opinions on that, but I think if that's all you're doing, then that's not enough. You should go another step and apply it and model that application for whoever you've invited or whoever you're gathering with. Did I have anything else? Yeah, well, I was going to just offer an example, right? So I'm an international relations scholar by training. If I were to acknowledge, as I have in the past, Algonquin territory, or Haudenosaunee territory, where I've given talks in the past, I try to apply something that I've learned about Algonquin territoriality or Haudenosaunee international relations. And it turns out when you look, there's an awful lot to learn and apply about that. The Haudenosaunee in particular have like over 1,000 years of international relations that they've even applied to offer citizenship to Black people who are being brutalized by the police in Toronto as recently as a couple of years ago. So these are living practices that we should be educating ourselves about when we engage in the act of a land acknowledgement. Back to you, Alex.
Sorry. All great points. I love the idea that AJ just referenced of these places existing simultaneously, right? It's a wonderful way of explaining it, I think, and thinking about like Halifax doesn't disappear, because we recognize Kijpuktuk. In fact, it's important that Halifax not disappear because a lot of the problems associated with, let's say, modern urban living ought not to be laid at the feet of Indigenous people who are like, oh, well, that's a problem. It's Kijpuktuk. It's all fucked up. No, Halifax is fucked up, right? But um, it doesn't mean that those places don't exist simultaneously, right? Like Canada as a nation state can continue to exist even as we talk about the necessity of recognizing and rebuilding Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous territorial control over their own nations and own territories. And there are elegant ways, I think, of exploring this and thinking through this. Anyway, I won't say any more about that. On to the next question. Okay. I took some bystander intervention training, but when the situation comes up in real life to intervene in microaggressions or full-on aggressions, I always feel like I might be trespassing on a BIPOC person's right to hold their own space. Do you have any thoughts on this? Once again, thank you for your question. Great question, complicated question for sure. We dealt with some of these questions before around interventions in public spaces, and I'm going to largely repeat what I've said before. I'm not sure my position is so different from that. But this is all like the question of how to deal with conflict is always difficult, let alone when you're talking about like oppressive behavior, or you're talking about racialized or gendered or sexualized oppressive behavior, or classed. Like we could go through all the axes of oppression and talk about this in different ways, right? So I appreciate you talking, like obviously you're talking about this in like sort of a racial justice scenario. You talk about BIPOC people, but I would say, I worry about these things in all kinds of settings. Like when I've been in settings where I'm dealing with, people from lower income communities, right? From poor neighborhoods. I worry about coming across like a middle class, elitist or something like that, right? So how do I effectively deal with situations that kind of unfold in front of me without looking like I'm trying to tut about it? So that's just all to say that I think we can talk about this in a racialized setting, but of course we could talk about any of these kinds of events across a multitude of different identity categories, whether that's class, race, ability, gender, sexuality, all these things. That being said, I think is both it's both a blessing and a curse in some ways, because the reality is we are surrounded by these kinds of oppressive relations and these like moments, right, where somebody says something, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but it's it's like either a borderline or a full-on offensive thing to say. And you're there and you've witnessed it and you're like, oh shit, what do I do? And I think for me, the question is always contextual, right? How, like, I have certain kinds of metrics. Like for me, it's how aggressively the statement or comment is made. If somebody is performing, like, because you talk about both, right? And I mean, we've talked about this before, and I don't mean to make this too big a point, but I don't like the language of microaggressions. I don't use that term. I'd like to know what you mean by that. I guess if you're talking about somebody like misgendering someone, let's say, right? I mean, this can be a tricky one, especially, and I don't want to be ageist, but with some older folks or elders, these politics, these issues are different for them. They struggle with it more. Sometimes this is accidental, right? And like somebody misgenders somebody, let's say, and it's like, it's a problem, but they meant it like because they're still learning. They didn't mean to do it. They're not trying to reinforce the boundaries of like a toxic heteronormativity, but they are like, that was the world that they were socialized and raised in, right? And they're working through it. I think it's important not to be like the social justice police, frankly, and jump all over people. And as you point out, to overwrite somebody else's autonomy, right? From if that person is standing right there and that the offender is talking right to them, then obviously, like, it's not your position to speak for that person. And, it's rarely a welcome thing unless the person looks really in kind of desperate straits. if it's a more sort of like aggressively oppressive thing that's been said, an outright racist comment, clear, like, we all know what we're talking about, right? Like anything like racist language, or like just something awful, then I think as a human in that space, you have a right to say, whoa, what is going on here? And I always think that, like, is that the kind of like that statement, that comment was made not just to that person, but in a public space that we're all sharing and participating. Therefore, if I heard it, if it reached my consciousness, then I have a right to engage it. And to like, not even to speak, I wouldn't try and speak on that person's behalf. I would simply say, that's an outrageous thing to say. Like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And I think that's so, like, it's a bit of a non-answer to you, unfortunately, because I think it's a bit of a sliding scale. Like, first of all, it depends on what the transgression is, and whether I think, and I know, like, people say intent ought not to matter, but I think sometimes, like when it's clear that it's kind of like a terrible accident. And I'm going to relate a personal experience here. I was like, my father he's dead. He died years ago. We were at a bar, though, like more than a decade ago, in Toronto, and when I was visiting, and we were being served by by a bartender who was like, androgynous, and clearly intentionally so, right? They never identified themselves. I didn't even know their name, right? They're bartender. They just served us. But my dad, who is hopeless on these things, kept referring to this person as a young man or something like that. And I'm like, this could go any different way. This person could be a he, a she. They could be non-binary. I'm not going to assume. And this bartender didn't want to get into it, right? So, like, my dad was completely unreconstructed along these things. So the issue is, like, how do you deal with that, right? Well, I just wanted him to stop talking. I wanted him to stop, like, addressing this person with it, like, by assuming that the gender was male. So I just tried to, like, take his attention away from it, and to sort of, like, settle it down, right? And say later on, like, I think you might have, like, gotten that wrong. You got to be careful about that, people. This was like, again, this was a decade or more ago, right? And I just use that example because this often happens in our personal encounters, right? It's easy to think, oh, what would I do if I encounter the hood wearing Ku Klux Klan member on the street who's screaming about Black people being, the same as monkeys or whatever? Well, it's easy to think, oh, I'm going to be the person who's going to go tear up that sign and, like, stand in the way and block it all. And great, but rarely do, the kind of everyday racist acts manifest in that way. They're much more subtle. They're much more couched in everyday discourse. And it becomes like a question of, are you going to, make a big intervention and blow it up and make it worse? Is the person who you perceive to be the victim going to be angry at you, as you say, for intervening on their behalf and stepping all over them and taking away their independence and autonomy? Are you going to get into a worse kind of situation? Have you misunderstood things? So I would say, though, like, at the root of it, if you're there, you clearly heard it, you are part of that discussion in some kind of way. This wasn't just like, you're not just walking by somebody on the street and you catch something really quickly, but you are sort of a participant in that. Then you have every right to intervene, in the sense that you are party to it. You can raise your concern about it. I wouldn't say, oh, how dare you in front of this person, blah, blah, blah. I'd say, hey, person, that, like, did you just say that? That's a really offensive. If it was an outright thing to say, then I would say that's a super offensive thing to say. What do you mean by that? Like, why are we talking like this? If it's one of these, like, dog whistle comments, that's harder to deal with, right? And I always like to dig down a bit. So if they use, whatever they're talking about, oh, well, how illegals are, or talking offensively about, whatever ethnic group, in some sort of, like, dog whistly way, right? Sort of like the triple brackets around supposedly Jewish people, on Twitter or whatever, this kind of dog whistly way, then my course of action usually is to kind of probe what they're, whether they're willing to, like, come out and say what they mean, or whether they're, beating around the bush for some other reason, and to get them to, like, sort of, like, either admit to it or back away from it. And I think otherwise you have to, like, it's a question of reading the room. Like, how uncomfortable is the person? Does the person look like they need assistance or help? Are you going to get into the middle of something where it's just not welcome? So those are difficult things to measure. But I hear you on all these points. It's a hard thing to know when to be a good intervener. AJ?
Yeah, so just building off of Alex's pretty comprehensive points there, I think the only thing I would really add would be to say there are lots of different ways to intervene depending on the circumstances, right? So I think he's absolutely right. The circumstances have to determine how you choose to intervene or not. I think the substance of your question, as I read it and understand it, is like, there are some instances where whether it's micro invalidation, whether it's like kind of everyday racism, really, it's so much a part of people's everyday, especially for BIPOC, that sometimes they just don't even want to acknowledge it. That ignoring it is and refusing to acknowledge the aggression in the first place is the choice that they've taken. And in those cases, and I'm thinking about situations where you might hear some like passing remark on the bus, or you might hear, so in reading the room, like Alex is saying, you have to really kind of like watch and see what the person is doing, what they want, what they need. I think it's not a problem to just put yourself in between if you can in that situation. And there are lots of different ways people have done that. It might be going and sitting next to the person and just striking up a conversation that has nothing to do with the assault that's happening or the invalidation that's happening. That can oftentimes be completely irritating for the person doing the aggressive behavior, right? And it's fine to irritate them, because I think the important thing to remember if you're trying to intervene in a constructive way is that it's got nothing to do with you. It's got nothing to do with the attacker. It's got everything to do with the person experiencing the harm. And in that sense, then, like, if it's somebody that's close to you or something, or a coworker situation where we oftentimes see these things happening, give your coworker, the BIPOC coworker, the opportunity to do whatever it is that they are going to do, because trust that this isn't the first, second, or last time that this is going to happen to them. And then when they're out of the room or out of the context, go and approach your colleague and actually have a very direct conversation with them. It's okay to make them uncomfortable and to make them feel unsafe and to make them feel violated in that regard. Say to them, what you just did there was racist. It was sexist. It was like, transphobic, whatever the issue might be. And you need to grapple with this. And if you're prepared to help them grapple with it, then by all means, in Alex's example, he was prepared to help his father understand that. We generally have love for the people in our everyday lives. You may not have any love for this person, and that's okay too. So again, reading the room, understanding when to intervene and how, understanding that, inserting yourself and your body to redirect harm is sometimes constructive if that's something that you can do. Our friend here in Halifax, I think we might have even talked about it before, was once attacked, him and his baby girl, on a city bus, just because, I don't even remember what the actual trigger point was, but it was a clear act of racism. Now our friend that this happened to, his name's Isaac. I don't think he would mind us telling him, because he's very publicly anti-racist in his life and his work. So he very deliberately escalated that situation and sought really concrete. He also happens to be a lawyer and a professor, so he's got the ability to move in different ways that not everybody can. Like if somebody's an undocumented worker, they don't have access to those kinds of same levels of institutional privileges. So you don't really know. But you really have to kind of trust your instinct and to correct yourself. I guess the last point I'll make is that this is an iterative process, right? You're going to intervene sometimes, and then you're going to learn from that maybe I shouldn't have at that moment, or maybe I should have held back and waited a little bit. But you're not going to really know that until you're willing to make the mistake. So I'm not saying go out there and try and be a superhero, but I'm saying read the room as best you can and trust your intelligence and your political understanding of what's happening, and then intervene. And usually it's better to intervene than to not intervene, because then you're problematizing the space, and you're not just educating the person. Like, basically, you're never educating the attacker, right? The attacker is never going to change their mind based on anything that you do, but you're educating the public, especially if this is happening in a public space. So by you asserting that whatever this attack or whatever this insinuation is has no place in the public domain, you're protecting the broader space from falling victim to that. And I feel that especially in an age of rising white nationalism, which Alex knows a lot more about than I do, but like it's important to battle for these public spaces and the sense of what is and is not acceptable in our public spaces. So I hope that's helpful. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I mean, I think that's a great point, really. And I would just, want to reiterate that a bit, that idea that you are, in pushing back, you're reclaiming that public space for something better than that person, that attacker is trying to make it into. And if we don't do that, then we really do cede that space every time we choose to look away to people who are willing to take it up, right? So yeah, it's a wonderful point that that really, I think, almost ought to be the operating principle for it, right? Like maybe maybe I'm going to get into it here. Maybe the person won't be totally grateful. But I don't want to live in a society where this stuff goes on the street, right? Like I don't want this person being harassed. I don't want to step in here and have these people being demeaned. This is not the society I want to live in, right?
Alex, can I just interrupt? Because I think, not to belabor this point, but there's one concrete example that I witnessed a couple years ago that I think will really help the asker of this question understand what we're talking about. I was in an event that the artist Kent Monkman was giving a lecture about their magnificent art. It was the release of The Scream and that whole series in 2017, actually. In the audience was a priest who used to be involved in the residential institutions. And that priest stood up and he started asking some absolutely heinous questions. Like it sounded like just like an old man, and his basic, without giving it too much credibility, like what he was saying was that we had good intentions. It was the government's fault, blah, blah, blah. The same kind of line you would imagine. None of the moderators did anything. You could see the distress in Monkman's face while Monkman was listening to this happen. And the only person in that whole auditorium, and I was in the auditorium, I didn't do anything either, so I'm not trying to paint myself in a positive light here. The only person who actually intervened was the American Sign Language interpreter, who was a Nigerian woman who stopped doing her job, walked right over to the priest who was asking these hurtful questions, took the microphone away from the person who was just continually handing the microphone over, ended up getting into a struggle where the priest punched her in the head. And she did this because she saw herself as being in solidarity with Monkman in that moment, as a person being publicly triggered by what seems, by obviously the hundreds of other people in the room, as no big deal. And she accepted those consequences. And they were triggering, and she was not all right afterwards. You know what I mean? And I don't mean the blow from the 90-year-old man. I mean the trauma of all of that. So, that is to me a perfect example of horizontal solidarity, the importance and the urgency of intervening, and what that does. Because I promise you, the 200 people in that library auditorium all walked away having learned a really important lesson from that. Sorry to interrupt.
It was a great story for sure. Great illustration of what we're talking about. But thank you again for that question. All right, let's move along to our next one. How do you deal with intergenerational trauma stemming from colonialism and racism in your own families? Great question. And yeah, again, it's always interesting and fruitful to be able to talk about this in the context of our own lives too. This is, I gotta be honest, I'm not sure that I have a great answer for this one either. So my family has rarely chosen to deal with these things in any kind of face forward, sort of confrontational way. To be totally honest, my father chose to deal with the legacies of not just colonialism. So my father, for those of you who are new or who haven't heard me talk about this before, was originally from Burma, left home in order to become one of the primary breadwinners for his family. He came from an upper caste family in Burma, in India, ultimately where my family ended up living. So he certainly came from, his own kind of privilege, but ended up working fairly hard life and coming to Canada as what I think is fair to say as an economic refugee. He wasn't fleeing political violence, but he certainly came here by way of a bunch of stops along the way in order to make enough money to help sustain family back home, and as well as to start a life here. My mother came to Canada as a refugee, as a displaced person, fleeing the Soviet occupation of Latvia at the end of World War II. And she lived in a displaced persons camp in England for about a decade before ultimately coming to Canada as a teenager. While she doesn't call herself a refugee, she was somebody fleeing war and forced out of her homeland, and had the great benefit of being like a white identified person, obviously, and coming to Canada, fairly welcome to Canada because of her racialized identity, but facing a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice and violence in England, and to some extent in Canada, but especially in England as a result of being Latvian, Western European, whatever, not speaking the language, not being from there, being poor, and all these kinds of things. Latvia is, like many of the Baltic states, a country that has been ridden over and over and over again throughout history by different colonizers, basically different conquerors. And obviously the history of India and the Indian subcontinent is a similar one, right? And like my parents carry a lot of this with them, and my dad certainly, my mom is still alive, thankfully, and she grapples, I think, all the time with the legacy of these experiences that affected her very profoundly. And I'm not going to lie, my whole family struggles with mental health issues that relate to anxiety, depression. My mom has, I don't think she would mind me saying, I hope not, but in the interest of public education, like I have no doubt she has post-traumatic stress as a result of her experiences, as a result of being certain that she was going to lose her parents, that she was going to be orphaned, that she was going to have to be left behind to be raised by a German family when my parents were originally fleeing, because she was Aryan looking enough and could speak German. So these experiences are incredibly scarring and informed her whole life, shaped her whole life, many in incredibly negative ways. And she never knew how to deal with them. She tried her absolute best, and raised a family and dealt with a very difficult and at times abusive husband throughout that. And that was only worse. And in his own defense, my father, who is in many ways a very talented man, a very gifted man who never got to pursue his talents, his passions, or his dreams, addressed the legacy, I think, of not just colonialism, but like shitty capitalist globalization, international white supremacy, all this kind of stuff, by drinking. He drank a lot, and he smoked a lot, and it destroyed his health. And he was a bad business person because he probably should have been an author or a writer or a philosopher or a professor or something like that, but was never given the opportunity. And so I tell that story only to say that I think my parents lived this out through their bodies and psyches in ways that were incredibly hard on them. And also that informed the way that my sister and I experienced those traumas. And so with my own kids, I try to have as many conversations about this as I can in ways that I think are appropriate. So I have a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old at home. Obviously, the things that they understand are different between the 14-year-old and the 10-year-old and what they're ready to hear. I tell lots of stories about how people learn to process grief and pain and the violence done to them, and the ways that are better to do that and the ways that are worse. I struggle with those issues myself, obviously. And in a weird way, I think they actually prevented me, because my parents never really wanted to tell stories about what it was like back home or growing up or about family. Even when I asked, even my sister and I asked, they just, those weren't stories they wanted to tell because they weren't sources of good memories for them. So it cuts you off in a weird way too from those family histories. So like, I hope this answer isn't a bummer. I'm not trying to be I'm just trying to be honest about this. Like, I don't have a good answer for this. I know people who work obviously in these fields, therapists, people who are committed political activists, who are, fellow members of community trying to pull each other up out of this. And I'm sure they have good technical advice for you. I don't have that technical advice. I would say my perspective comes from a place where I witnessed my grandparents, both of whom fled Latvia. So my mom's parents, in other words, came here, who spent their lives mourning the loss of their homeland and mourning having to be what they thought of as refugees, coming to a country they never wanted to live in, even though they're white people, and could come here and benefited from that. And my father spent his life mourning, I think, the lost opportunities that he wasn't allowed to have, as well as confronting a brutally racist Canadian society that, especially when he and my mom got together in Toronto, never believed a man that dark should be with a woman that white, and faced constant harassment and threats from everything from cops to people on the street. He lived with that. He lived with the fact that the burden, I think, of dealing with that and the weight of expectation. And you see how that shatters people. I guess all I'd say is that for all of you, like, if you're one of those people who thinks that too much is made of this legacy of like bearing the burdens of the violence and trauma faced by previous generations, like, it's not just these awful anonymous graveyards filled with dead children here in Canada, right? That's one spectacular and terribly awful outcome of these legacies of violence and trauma. But it's also this kind of like daily grinding shittiness that people experience that doesn't have to be that dramatic, but actually like shapes people's response to stress and anxiety and trauma and loss. And they pass on those ways of relating. Like, I'm kind of tired of hearing people talk about how trauma and the genes and how it, like, I don't disregard that. I'm not a biologist. I won't speak to the genetic legacy of trauma, but I can speak as a social scientist and also just somebody who lives through it, to the inherited legacies we pass on, right? And that we reproduce, and those ways of dealing with grief and pain. So my dad's alcoholism, for example, was one way he insulated himself that had dramatic effects for the rest of his family and the world around him and his own health ultimately, right? So it's in understanding this and actually like learning to be empathetic and compassionate about it, but also recognizing that that is just, it's resonating down through generations, right? So that original, like, if you want to see, if you're one of these people who's like, oh, well, Canadian colonialism happened hundreds of years ago, what's the big deal now? Yes, but think about the debris that gets passed down, that kind of incredible resonant wastefulness that has shaped the lives of generations to come after that, and passed down in those ways of relating, in those forms of abuse, in alcohol or other drug dependencies, in that hopelessness and that sense of being torn out of place and out of time, all that kind of stuff, and having to grapple with that. And just having that compassion necessary to deal with that. Over to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. And I see we're coming up on time, so maybe I'll answer this question and kind of wrap us up for the session. Yeah. So, I mean, how do I deal with intergenerational trauma? I would say very poorly, and not in a direct way. And it manifests through so many different means. It's so intersectional, like, yeah, there's race, but there's mental health, there's like gender, there's class, there's caste, there's all these different things coming together. I come from a country originally that is basically, in many ways, I think, defined by intergenerational trauma from colonialism. Originally come from Trinidad and Tobago. The kind of dilemmas that I see Trinidad struggle with in particular, and in Trinidadian culture, is so defined by intergenerational culture that's not, I think, adequately addressed at all. So like just from a personal standpoint, I guess my individual family unit that I grew up in tried to deal with this mostly through succeeding by the mainstream metrics of what success was, such that when people kind of like tried to say anything to you, you could just like rub it in their face and be like, well, screw you, I've already beaten you at your game. That was the kind of strategy. And oftentimes we lost at the game, you know, because the rules of the game aren't always equal in the first place. But what, like, you know, I think that the manifestations of intergenerational trauma, like it shows up in things like the food that you eat. Like my family's relationship to food, I think is profoundly unhealthy, even though it's like, and I think it's in part because so much of our cultural identity is enveloped in food, because it was the sort of one thing that we could easily preserve for ourselves when we came, not even easily, with great difficulty preserve for ourselves here when we left Trinidad and into Canada. And it leads to all kinds of problems, you know, like whether it's obesity, whether it's like, you know, related heart issues that come about from that. And that's just one example of like many. Some of the more constructive ways, because I think we're fortunate in this regard, we had these firm foundations from which to try to do work otherwise. Like, so I have 3 brothers. It's interesting that we've all ended up working in some capacity that relates to conceptions of correcting structural white supremacy. You know, so I'm obviously a professor. I deal with this stuff all the time. I have a brother who's a police officer, and he was a diversity officer, and he's now a master's student who works on these themes. I have another brother who's, you know, like a really successful playwright and dramaturg who has great work that deals probably most closely with intergenerational trauma. He's got a book that was nominated, a play nominated for the Governor General's Award called Take the Milkna, that was actually all about basically this intergenerational trauma. And I have another brother who's worked in multicultural television and radio for most of his professional life. So it's interesting how we've all, without consciously trying to do this, all ended up doing very similar, albeit quite distinct kinds of work. But, you know, it's definitely, we could talk for 8 hours about this one, especially because so I think it's easier to deal with structural, bigger picture issues like colonialism, like violence and stuff. And personally, it's way harder to deal with how these things affect you as the individual. So that is a constant work in progress. And don't be too hard on yourself, but try to do things that make your life and your family's life better, to try and like stop it as much from going on to the next generations. With that, thanks everybody for your thoughtful questions. We always enjoy spending time with you in the virtual sphere. We'll be back at it with Safe Space for White Questions on the last Wednesday of February. Same time, same place. Many thanks to Fernwood. Many thanks to my comrade, Dr. Kasnabish over here in the corner. And yeah, we will see you again next month.